You are a lord. Picture it. Trumpets sounding across the valley at dawn, siege engines rolled into place under cover of mist, a castle wall crumbling within days, the garrison begging for terms as your banner rises over their gate. You ride in as a conqueror, your name spoken in halls you have never even visited, and everyone remembers the battle for generations to come. Now open the ledger. A siege is not measured in days, it is measured in months. A 13th century English lord besieging a rival's castle might spend 20 to 30 pounds a month just to keep an army fed, paid, and armed in the field, without a single stone yet falling from the wall. Compare that to a laborer's wage, roughly 2 pence a day. That single monthly bill equals thousands of days of ordinary labor, and you may need 3, 5, even 10 months before the walls finally give way. Some sieges never succeed at all, and the money spent simply vanishes into the mud outside the walls, along with the men who never made it home. The math only gets worse the longer you look at it. 10 pence spent today does not disappear once it disappears. Every single day the siege continues, whether or not a single arrow is loosed. A campaign that runs 6 months at 25 pounds a month reaches 150 pounds before you have gained an inch of ground, and that figure assumes nothing goes wrong, nothing ever goes entirely as planned. You are not buying a battle, you are buying time, and time, it turns out, is the most expensive thing you will ever own. Every romantic image you carried into this, the banners, the trumpets, the single decisive charge, belongs to a battle that lasts an afternoon. What you have actually signed up for lasts through changing seasons, through harvest you will miss at home, through a slow and grinding contest that has almost nothing to do with courage and almost everything to do with arithmetic. Motive shapes your budget more than you might expect, and it is worth being honest with yourself about which category you fall into before the first tent is pitched. If the king summoned you to serve in his cause, part of the cost is technically his to bear, but royal pay often arrives late, incomplete, or not at all, leaving you to quietly cover the gap yourself while still fulfilling your duty and maintaining appearances before your peers. Kings are notorious for promising reimbursement that arrives years after the campaign, if it arrives at all, and a lord who complains too loudly risks his standing rather than his coin. If this is your own private land dispute, every single penny is yours from the very first day, and no one will reimburse a failed campaign no matter how justified your claim was. You are financing a lawsuit with an army instead of a court, and courts, whatever their flaws, rarely cost £100 a month. If you are crushing a rebellion on your own doorstep, speed matters more than money, because a rebellion left unchecked can spread to your own tenants, infect neighboring estates, and unravel your authority entirely within a single season. Here the calculation flips. The true cost of doing nothing may exceed the cost of acting, however painful the ledger looks in the moment. Whatever the reason behind your banners, you are about to discover that sieges reward patience and punish impatience without mercy, and patience, unfortunately, costs money every single day you wait outside those walls. The lord who cannot afford to wait is the lord who loses, regardless of how just his cause might have been. Feudal obligation gives you knights bound by duty, typically for around 40 days a year, largely unpaid beyond their own basic upkeep and equipment. This sounds generous until you remember that 40 days rarely breaks a well-provisioned castle, no matter how determined your men are or how skillfully your engines are aimed. Most sieges that succeed quickly are the exception, not the rule. Beyond that 40-day window, you are paying mercenaries out of your own coffers, and the market for hired soldiers works exactly like any other market. Prices rise when demand is high and fall when it is not. A mounted man-at-arms might cost roughly 1 shilling a day, a foot soldier a few pence, and skilled crossbowmen or engineers who know how to build and aim a trebuchet demand considerably more still, because their expertise is rare and their leverage is real. For an army of a few hundred men sustained over several months, wages alone can climb to 40 to 60 pounds before a single stone is ever thrown at the wall, and that figure only grows the longer the siege drags on. There is also the quieter cost of simply keeping men present. Horses need shoeing, weapons need repair, and idle soldiers waiting for orders still expect to be paid whether or not they have fought that week. You will also discover that recruiting is its own negotiation. Experienced mercenary captains know their worth and will not commit their companies cheaply, especially to a siege with an uncertain timeline. The best soldiers go to the lords who can prove they will still be paying wages in month 4, not just month 1. A trebuchet is not simply bought from a merchant, it is built on site, by carpenters and smiths who must themselves be paid, fed, and housed for weeks while they work. Timber, iron fittings, thick rope, and skilled labor for one large engine can easily run several pounds, and a serious siege usually needs more than one, positioned at different points along the wall to divide the defender's attention and multiply the pressure. A siege tower, tall enough to reach the battlements, demands even more material and time to construct properly. Entire trees felled and shaped, wheels strong enough to bear tremendous weight across uneven ground, and animal hides stretched across its front face as crude protection against fire. After all that investment of coin and labor, it can burn to ash in a single night if the defenders are ready with fire arrows or boiling oil, and there is no insurance policy waiting to make you whole again. Mining is another option, quieter and sometimes cheaper than engines, but it demands skilled tunnelers who understand how to collapse a wall's foundation without collapsing themselves along with it, and this too requires payment, timber for supports, and weeks of patient, dangerous labor beneath the ground while the garrison above listens for the telltale sounds. Every engine, every tower, every tunnel is essentially a wager. Will this particular investment be the one that finally breaks the wall, or will it simply become another line in your ledger, another pile of ash or collapsed timber to write off, before construction begins again elsewhere along the perimeter? Your costs are fixed per week, almost regardless of what actually happens on the field that day. Wages accrue whether an arrow is fired or not. Grain is eaten whether an assault is launched or not. The castle's fall, by contrast, is not fixed at all. It could come tomorrow morning or it could come never. And there is very little you can do to force the timeline beyond throwing more resources at a problem that resources alone cannot always solve. A well-provisioned garrison can hold for months on stored grain alone, watching you from the walls as your resources dwindle in full view, well aware that time is working against you far more than it is working against them. Every extra week means another wage bill delivered to the paymaster's tent, another cartload of provisions hauled from your own lands or purchased at inflated wartime prices, another opportunity for disease, desertion, or simple bad weather to unravel your army before the enemy's walls ever do. This is the cruelest part of the entire arithmetic. The passage of time itself becomes an active threat, working steadily against you in the background even on days when absolutely nothing visible occurs. A quiet week outside the walls is not a peaceful week on your ledger. It is simply another expensive week that produced no progress whatsoever, indistinguishable in cost from a week of fierce fighting, but far more demoralizing to everyone counting the days. A hired soldier has no real guarantee of pay if your funds run short mid-campaign, and his true hope, beyond the modest coin promised to him, is plunder once the walls finally fall and the castle's contents become fair game. This shared expectation of eventual reward is often the invisible glue holding a mercenary company together through the tedious, uneventful months of a long siege. If the siege drags on with no prospect of loot anywhere on the horizon, morale collapses quickly among the ranks. Men who signed on for a quick, profitable campaign begin to question whether they will ever see either payment or plunder, and doubt spreads through a camp faster than any illness. Soldiers slip away in the night, taking their equipment and sometimes a fellow soldier or two with them, and you are left paying full wages for a steadily shrinking force, while your monthly bill stays exactly the same as before their departure. Some soldiers gamble differently, staying not out of loyalty, but because leaving mid-campaign without proper release can damage a mercenary's reputation for future contracts elsewhere. Even desertion, it turns out, has its own quiet economics, weighed carefully by men who make their living moving from siege to siege across the region. Thousands of men and their horses eat every single day, whether or not the castle falls that particular week, and this simple biological fact quietly becomes one of the largest and most relentless items on your entire budget. Grain, livestock, and fodder must be hauled in from your own lands, at real cost and real distance, or, more often out of sheer necessity, seized directly from nearby villages. This choice of seizure can quietly turn local farmers into bitter enemies of your own cause, long after the siege itself ends and you have moved on to other matters. A countryside stripped bare to feed a besieging army does not forget quickly, and the resentment sown during a few months of requisitioning can outlast the siege by years, poisoning your standing with tenants you will still need to rely on come next year's harvest. A poor harvest in the surrounding countryside compounds the problem severely. It can starve your own camp long before it ever starves, the garrison safely tucked inside the walls with their own careful ration stores gathered months in advance for exactly this situation. The besieger, ironically, often runs out of food before the besieged do, a fact that has ended more than a few campaigns quietly and without a single decisive battle. Crowded camps, poor sanitation, and stagnant water kill far more men than arrows ever manage to, a grim reality that every experienced commander understands, even if it is rarely spoken of in the songs sung about famous sieges afterward. A single outbreak of dysentery or fever can cost you a third of your force within just a few weeks, tearing through tightly packed tents with no regard for rank, wages owed, or how bravely a man has fought. There is no amount of gold that buys your way out of it once it has already begun spreading through the camp, and often the only remedy available to a period physician is simply waiting it out, isolating the worst cases where possible, and burying the dead with whatever dignity time allows. Physicians of the era understand remarkably little about the true causes of contagion, and their remedies, however well-intentioned, rarely change the outcome once an outbreak has taken hold. The psychological toll compounds the physical one. Soldiers who watch their tent mates sicken and die from an invisible enemy they cannot fight back against often lose heart faster than soldiers facing an enemy they can actually see across a battlefield. A camp gripped by fear of illness becomes harder to hold together than one facing a determined assault, and more than one siege is quietly dissolved not from military defeat but from an army simply refusing to remain in a place that felt cursed. Inside those walls, someone is doing the exact same arithmetic as you. How long can our stores actually last? And is relief truly coming from a nearby ally who has been informed of the siege and asked for aid? A well-stocked castle, prepared months in advance by a garrison commander who understood a siege might eventually come, can outlast a poorly funded besieging force with surprising ease, no matter how determined the army camped outside looks from the ramparts. Castles built with siege in mind often include deep wells, extensive granaries, and carefully rationed stores calculated to last far longer than most attackers expect or budget for. The defenders know this. They watch your camp, count your fires, and often have a fairly accurate sense of how long an army your size can realistically sustain itself before hunger or debt forces a decision. Your patience is not really fighting stone and mortar at all. It is fighting their patience, penny for penny and grain for grain, month after grinding, month In a contest where the side that quietly runs out of resources first loses, regardless of who holds the moral or strategic high ground. This is why so many sieges end not in dramatic breaches, but in quiet, negotiated surrenders, timed to whichever side's ledger gives out first. Wages across the campaign. Roughly 40 to 60 pounds, assuming the siege runs several months and requires supplementing your feudal levy with hired mercenaries for the bulk of the duration. Siege engines and their construction, including repairs and replacements after failed assaults or enemy sabotage, 5 to 10 pounds, though a truly stubborn castle might require rebuilding an engine more than once. Provisions hauled or purchased over several months, another 30 to 50 pounds, a figure that climbs sharply if local harvests are poor, or if you choose to purchase grain honestly rather than seize it and inflame the countryside. Add repairs to damaged equipment, replacement horses lost to disease, raids, or simple exhaustion, and the unexpected losses that always seem to appear along the way, a bridge that needs rebuilding, a bribe paid to a local guide, medicine purchased in a desperate attempt to slow an outbreak. Sum it all together, and a mid-sized siege can easily total 100 to 150 pounds, a sum that could equal years of a modest baron's entire annual income, spent chasing an outcome that was never guaranteed from the very start of the campaign. Converted into a laborer's daily wage of roughly 2 pence, this represents tens of thousands of working days poured into a single military venture, an almost incomprehensible transfer of value from productive labor into a contest of endurance between two ledgers. Victory can bring you new land, ransom money from captured nobles worth far more than any wage bill you accumulated along the way, and the castle itself as a lasting prize to hold, garrison, or grant to a loyal ally as reward for their service. A successful siege can transform a struggling lord into a genuinely wealthy one, almost overnight, particularly if a high-value noble is captured and his family proves willing to pay handsomely for his release. But this outcome is far from guaranteed, and the alternative is considerably darker. Defeat, or a siege quietly abandoned half-finished when the money finally runs dry and soldiers refuse to continue without pay, leaves you with an empty treasury, a resentful and thoroughly stripped countryside that resents you nearly as much as it resented the enemy, and nothing at all to show for months of relentless spending except a smaller, warier army than the one you started with and a reputation weakened by very public failure. The gap between these two outcomes is enormous, and unlike a battle decided in an afternoon, a siege often gives you months of mounting evidence about which direction you are heading before the final result arrives, evidence that a wiser lord learns to read honestly, rather than continuing to pour money into a campaign that the numbers have already quietly condemned. A siege was never just a battle fought with swords and stone and courage, however the songs and chronicles might choose to remember it afterward. It was, at its core, a contest of ledgers. Whoever's money and grain outlasted the other side's walls simply won in the end, almost regardless of who fought more bravely on any given day or which side's cause was more just. You did not conquer a castle through strength alone, no matter how skilled your engineers or how brave your soldiers proved themselves to be. You outspent one, penny by penny, month by grinding month, until the other side's own ledger finally ran out first, or until yours did, and the campaign quietly ended in whichever direction the arithmetic ultimately pointed. The walls were never really the obstacle. The obstacle was always the number of days your treasury could keep paying men to stand in front of them, waiting for stone to finally give way to patience.